The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 34th floor, casting long shadows across the mahogany conference table. Miami sprawled beneath them in all its glittering chaos. Palm trees, glass towers, and the Atlantic Ocean forming a postcard-perfect backdrop that Victoria Chen had learned to ignore entirely. She'd been working at Ashford Technologies for exactly 117 days. Not that she was counting. Her desk, positioned strategically outside the executive corner office, was a monument to organized chaos. 3 monitors arranged in a perfect arc. A desk calendar color-coded by priority, a small succulent plant that she'd named Gerald, positioned exactly 6 inches from her keyboard. Everything had its place. Everything followed rules. Predictability was the closest thing Victoria had to a spiritual practice. This was why the email from Human Resources had caused her hands to tremble slightly as she read it on her phone during her morning coffee. Richard Ashford will begin his tenure as CEO effective immediately. Please prepare his office and schedule an introductory meeting for 9 a.m. sharp. Richard Ashford. The Richard Ashford. The man who'd earned the nickname the Surgeon in Silicon Valley because he could cut through a company like Precision Steel and somehow make it more valuable. The man who'd fired an entire department via email. The man whose TED Talk on organizational efficiency had been viewed 14 million times. The man whose file photo made him look like he'd never smiled in his entire life. Victoria had spent the last 3 months working for David Mortensen, the previous CEO, a pleasant man in his 60s who brought donuts on Fridays and asked her about her weekend. David had said things like, "Take your time," and no rush on that report. David had once thanked her for doing her job. Those days were apparently over. She'd arrived at the office by 7:30 a.m., which was 20 minutes earlier than usual. The corner office had been thoroughly cleaned by the night crew, but Victoria had still gone through it herself, adjusting every painting so it hung perfectly centered, ensuring the executive desk held only a leather desk set and a framed photograph of what looked like a sailboat. She'd programmed his computer, set up his phone system, and even organized his filing cabinet, though something told her he'd reorganize it anyway. At 8:45 a.m., the elevator dinged. Victoria looked up from her monitoring station. 3 screens showing calendar invites, email traffic, and a live floor plan of who was in the building. She'd learned early on that information was armor in the corporate world. The man who emerged from the elevator was not what she expected, which was ridiculous because she'd seen his photograph approximately 7,000 times by that point. The photo had not captured the way he moved. Richard Ashford walked like someone who was always 3 steps ahead of the conversation. Economical, precise, with the kind of posture that suggested his spine had been engineered in a lab. He wore an impeccably tailored grey suit that probably cost more than Victoria's monthly rent. His hair was dark and too perfectly styled to be accidental. He was carrying a single black briefcase and looking at his phone with the expression of someone reading about the downfall of civilization. He was, Victoria had to admit to herself in a moment of pure honesty, objectively impressive. Like a luxury car, beautiful to look at, but you definitely need to budget for the maintenance. He didn't look up as he walked past her desk. "Mr. Ashford," Victoria called out, standing with the kind of professional posture she'd perfected over 8 years of executive assistant work. "Good morning. Welcome to Ashford Technologies. I'm Victoria Chen, your executive assistant." He stopped. For the first time, he looked directly at her, and Victoria experienced what she would later describe to her friend Marcus as unexpected eye contact intensity. His eyes were a complicated shade between grey and blue, and they seemed to be conducting a complete background check on her in approximately 2 seconds. "Victoria," he said, and his voice was exactly as it sounded in recorded interviews, controlled, slightly clipped, with just enough of a southern accent to indicate old money. "Walk me through my 9 o'clock." "Of course," Victoria said, moving with him toward his office. "You have a meeting with the board of directors to review the quarterly projections. 14 attendees. Conference room B, already set up with coffee, water, and the presentation materials you requested. The presentation materials I haven't requested yet. The ones I anticipated you'd request, Victoria corrected. Financial reports for the last 3 quarters, market analysis, competitor benchmarking, and a document outlining the 3 primary areas where the company is bleeding money. All color-coded and indexed. He paused at his office door. You've been here how long? 117 days. Something flickered across his face, possibly respect, possibly indigestion. Victoria had learned not to read too much into facial expressions. Facts were more reliable. The last assistant lasted 8 months, he said. I'm better organized than most people, Victoria replied. I don't require emotional validation, and I take my job seriously. Excellent. Because if you're going to work for me, we need to establish some ground rules immediately. He extended his hand. Victoria looked at his hand, then she looked at his face. Then she looked back at his hand, as if it might have changed composition in the intervening seconds. It had not. This was the moment, the exact moment, when everything shifted. Later, when people asked her how she and Richard had met, Victoria would describe it as an honest start. What she meant was that she'd been honest about who she was, and he'd immediately discovered that he had no idea how to manage someone who didn't follow the standard protocols of professional interaction. I don't shake hands, Victoria said. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that had its own physical weight. She could feel it pressing against her eardrums. Excuse me? Richard's hand remained extended, hovering in the space between them like a confused bird. With people I've just met, Victoria clarified, because she did have some professional standards. I don't shake hands with people I don't know. It's a personal rule. A personal rule, he repeated flatly. Yes. You work in corporate America. Yes. And you have a personal rule against the universal gesture of professional greeting. That's correct. His hand dropped slowly. He stared at her for a long moment, and Victoria could see his brain attempting to process this deviation from expected behavior. His jaw tightened slightly. A small muscle in his cheek twitched. Why? He finally asked. Victoria hesitated. This was the part where most people wanted a rational explanation. The truth was more complicated, buried somewhere in the territory between anxiety and control and a childhood incident involving a birthday party and a stranger's sweaty palm that she'd never quite recovered from. It feels too intimate for someone I don't know, she said instead, which was also true, just not the whole truth. I prefer to establish professional relationships based on actual interaction rather than ceremonial handshakes. We can reassess after we've worked together for a while. Richard blinked, twice. You're rejecting a handshake on the grounds that it's too intimate, he said slowly, in a gesture specifically designed to be the opposite of intimate. I understand the contradiction, Victoria said. Do you? Yes. But it's still my preference. He looked at his hand, which was still hanging in the air between them like an accusation. Then he looked back at her. She watched him make a decision. She could see the moment it happened, the slight adjustment in his pupils, the way his shoulders reset. Fine, he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested this particular interaction was being filed away in the part of his brain reserved for personnel complications. No handshake. I'll see you at the board meeting. He turned and walked into his office without another word, and Victoria stood there for exactly 7 seconds, her heart doing something unusual and mostly unwelcome in her chest. She'd just rejected the CEO of her company's handshake on his first day. She'd probably just made a terrible mistake. The board meeting was, from a technical standpoint, a success. Richard had reviewed the materials with the kind of speed that suggested his brain operated at a higher processing frequency than most humans. He'd asked 17 questions, identified 6 problems that the previous leadership had apparently ignored, and somehow managed to make 2 of the board members laugh. actual laughs, not the polite corporate chuckles that usually accompanied executive humor. By the time Victoria had collected the materials from the conference room, she'd heard through the office grapevine that the new CEO was impressive, terrifying, and definitely going to shake things up. What she hadn't heard was that he'd mentioned her. She discovered this when her phone buzzed at 1 p.m. with a calendar invitation. Lunch meeting, Richard Ashford's office. Ude 0 p.m., Victoria Chen. "Why am I having lunch with him?" she muttered to Marcus, her best friend and fellow executive assistant who worked on the 32nd floor. He'd come down to her desk to discuss the latest office drama, which primarily involved someone stealing lunches from the break room refrigerator. Marcus leaned against her desk, eyes widening. "You mean the intimidating CEO who fires people for sport?" "Allegedly." "Victoria, that man does not have casual lunches. He probably wants to fire you for the handshake incident." "He's not going to fire me." "How do you know?" "Because if he was going to fire me, he'd do it via email. He strikes me as someone who handles unpleasant tasks with maximum efficiency and minimum human contact." "That's actually fair," Marcus admitted. At 12:58 p.m., Victoria walked into Richard's office carrying 2 turkey sandwiches, a small salad, and 3 bottles of water. She'd made the educated guess that a man who looked like he'd never consumed a carb in his life would probably prefer to skip lunch entirely, but she'd included a sandwich anyway. The water was essential. Maintaining hydration improved cognitive function by approximately 15%, according to the neurological studies she'd read at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. She was beginning to understand that she had a problem with research-based obsession. "I brought lunch," she announced, setting everything on the small conference table in the corner of his office. "I wasn't sure of your preferences, so I went with turkey on whole wheat, minimal sodium. The salad dressing is on the side." Richard looked up from his computer, where he'd apparently been doing something that required intense concentration. His tie had been loosened slightly, the first sign of anything approaching casualness she'd witnessed from him. "You're efficient," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. Bring your lunch and sit down." Victoria had not been expecting this. She'd assumed she'd be leaving, returning to the comfort of her desk and her organized spreadsheets and her succulent plant named Gerald. Sitting down to lunch with the CEO suggested a level of social interaction that fell outside her normal parameters. She retrieved her own lunch, a carefully portioned container of rice, vegetables, and grilled chicken, and sat in the chair across from him. "Walk me through your first 117 days, he said, unwrapping his sandwich. "Excuse me?" "Your tenure, your experience, your assessment of the company's operational weaknesses. I assume you've noticed them, given your organizational tendencies." Victoria blinked. "You want a complete analysis of company operations during your lunch?" "I want your perspective," Richard clarified. "You've been here long enough to understand the baseline, but short enough that you haven't become acclimated to dysfunction. That's useful. Also, the handshake thing suggested you might have opinions that deviate from standard corporate thinking." "Indeed, the handshake thing suggests I have anxiety," Victoria said flatly. "Does it?" She considered lying. Professional relationships were built on strategic self-presentation, on showing your best self and hiding the parts that didn't contribute to a positive workplace dynamic. She was very good at this. She'd been doing it for 8 years. But something about the way he was looking at her, with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, made her set down her fork. "Yes," she said, "I have anxiety about unpredictability. Handshakes feel unpredictable. They're moist sometimes, and you don't know how firm the grip will be, and there's an inherent awkwardness in the transition between not touching and touching. I like things that follow patterns, rules. I like to know what's going to happen." Richard ate his sandwich thoughtfully. "That must make working in corporate America extremely painful." "Often," Victoria admitted, "yet you do it anyway." "I'm very good at creating predictability within chaos," she said. "I've learned to build systems that minimize variables, color coding, calendars." Organizational structures. I can't control what other people do, but I can control how I respond to it. He nodded slowly, as if this made complete sense to him. The company has 6 operational areas where efficiency is below target. You've probably already identified them. 7, Victoria corrected, though the 7th is more of a cultural problem than an operational one. The sales department and the development team don't communicate effectively, which creates redundancy in project planning. Have you brought this to anyone's attention? No, I'm an executive assistant, not a consultant. My job is to support you, not audit the company. Your job, Richard said carefully, is to make my life easier, which means I need accurate information. If you see something broken, you tell me, understood? Understood. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Through the window, Miami glittered and carried on, completely unaware that Victoria was having what felt like the most surreal conversation of her professional life. "Why are you really having lunch with me?" she asked. "Because you rejected my handshake," Richard said. "That suggested you might be someone who operates based on actual principles rather than social convention. I'm going to need someone like that, and I wanted to assess whether you were someone I could work with long-term." "And your assessment?" "Incomplete," he said, "but promising." By the end of the first week, Richard had restructured 3 departments, fired 1 regional manager, and made it clear that business as usual was no longer an operational philosophy at Ashford Technologies. He'd also, Victoria noticed, stopped trying to shake her hand. Instead, he'd developed a habit of stopping by her desk multiple times a day, with questions that ranged from the operational, "How should we handle the overlap between marketing and product development?" to the oddly personal, "What makes a good organizational structure in your opinion?" Victoria discovered that Richard had a dry sense of humor that manifested in unexpected moments. When a vendor sent him a proposal filled with grammatical errors, he'd printed it out and left it on her desk with a single note. "Please ensure our communications don't look like they were written by someone having a stroke." She'd laughed, actually laughed. At work, at the CEO's joke about stroke-induced writing. This was how she knew something was shifting. By the second week, they'd fallen into a rhythm. Early mornings, where Richard would review market analyses she'd compiled. Late afternoons, where they'd discuss strategic decisions. Moments where his carefully controlled exterior would slip, usually when talking about technology or when someone in a meeting suggested an idea that was aggressively mediocre. "That strategy is intellectually lazy," he'd said in a meeting, and Victoria had watched the room collectively decide they'd never suggest anything mediocre ever again. She'd also discovered that his phone had a note in it. One of those Notes app entries that you find when you're syncing his calendar with the master schedule, and you definitely aren't supposed to be reading his personal reminders, but you do it anyway because you're an anxious person with boundary issues. The note said, "Meditation. Call Mom, ask Victoria about the Chen family restaurant thing." He'd asked her about her family's restaurant empire, which was not actually an empire, just a very successful dim-sum place in Coral Gables, the next day, and had listened to her explain the entire operational structure without checking his phone once. By the end of the second week, Victoria had made a list on her personal notes, a list she definitely wasn't going to show anyone, least of all herself, titled "Problematic Observations About the CEO." He actually listens when you talk. He has an excellent memory for details about people's lives. His smile is relatively rare but genuinely transformative when it appears. He smells like expensive cologne and something else that's probably competence. He has called her Victoria in a tone that suggests her name is a complete sentence. There is something deeply unsettling about working for someone whose opinion you've started to care about. She deleted the list after 3 days, but the observations remained. On Friday of the second week, Richard stopped by her desk at 6:45 p.m., when most of the office had emptied out, and the Miami sunset was turning the sky into something that looked aggressively photoshopped. "Stay late," he said. It was not a question. We need to review the restructuring plans for Q2. Victoria had plans to meet Marcus at a bar called the Rum Shack, but she found herself nodding and pulling up the files anyway. They worked in the conference room until 9:30 p.m. when Richard finally leaned back and said, "This is good. You're catching inconsistencies that the actual strategic consultants missed." "I have a lot of anxiety about consistency," Victoria said. "It makes you very thorough." "Your anxiety is becoming my competitive advantage," Richard observed. "That's remarkably efficient. Are you making a joke about my mental health?" "I'm observing that human variation produces value in different contexts," he said. "Your particular configuration of anxiety and organizational thinking is making you invaluable to this company. That's not a joke. That's an assessment." Victoria gathered her materials slowly, very aware of the fact that they were alone in the building. Just the two of them, in an empty conference room, with the city lights spreading out below them like a constellation. "Do you do this a lot?" she asked carefully. "Work this late?" "Since university," Richard said. "I'm not naturally gifted. I had to work harder than everyone else to get the same results. So I worked harder than everyone else to get better results. It became a habit." "What's your excuse?" "I like knowing that things are under control," Victoria said. "Working late means I can ensure everything is prepared for the next day. No surprises." "You're terrified of surprises." "Yes. But you took this job," Richard said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he understood exactly what she'd done. "You took a job working for someone with a reputation for being unpredictable, for changing things suddenly, for disrupting comfortable situations." Victoria met his eyes. "Yes." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than it had any right to be. "Because I wanted to know if I could handle something I couldn't control," Victoria said quietly. "And because I wanted to know if there was someone in the world who could function the way I do. Someone who understood that predictability is a choice, not a failure." Richard was quiet for a long moment. He was doing that thing where his jaw tightened slightly and that small muscle in his cheek twitched. "You're very observant," he said finally. "About other people, not just about systems and organization, but about actual humans." "It's a survival mechanism," Victoria said. "If you can predict behavior, you can control your response to it. It reduces anxiety." "Does it work?" "Not really," Victoria admitted. "But I keep trying." He stood up then, started gathering his own materials, and as he passed her desk on the way out, he paused, just for a moment, like he was going to say something else. He didn't. But Victoria realized, as she watched him walk toward the elevator, that she was genuinely disappointed. The third week was when everything started to become genuinely complicated. It began with a mistake. A small one, barely noticeable to anyone except Victoria and Richard, but enough to create the first real tension between them. A client presentation had been scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. A significant client, the kind of client whose projects generated approximately 20% of the company's revenue and whose account manager was a woman named Karen, who had opinions about everything and wasn't afraid to express them aggressively. Victoria had prepared for the presentation with her usual obsessive attention to detail. She'd compiled the market research, created the visual materials, and coordinated with the development team to ensure all the deliverables were accurately represented. Everything was scheduled for 3 p.m. in Conference Room A. At 2:45 p.m., she'd received an email from Richard. "Move the meeting to the roof. Conference Room A is being used for emergency inventory." It was the kind of email that was technically fine but operationally chaotic. The roof didn't have proper AV setup. There was no weather protection. But Richard was the CEO, and the CEO's word was final. Victoria had spent 45 minutes scrambling. She'd coordinated with IT to move equipment. She'd arranged for outdoor tables and chairs. She'd made sure there was water and coffee available. She'd even checked the weather forecast 3 times to confirm that a storm wasn't going to ruin the presentation. The presentation had been successful. Karen had approved the project expansion. The client had signed the contract. But on Thursday morning, Richard had called her into his office. "Why did you move the meeting to the roof?" he'd asked. Victoria had stared at him. "Because you asked me to." "I didn't ask you to move it to the roof. I asked you to move it out of conference room A. You said conference room A was being used for emergency inventory, which meant you should have moved it to conference room B or C or literally any other indoor space that we have available." The silence that followed this exchange was different from the previous silence. It was the silence of someone who'd realized they'd made an assumption, and the assumption had been wrong. "I interpreted your email as indicating urgency," Victoria said carefully. "Roof was the first available alternative space. You interpreted my vague email as indicating something that required a complete logistical overhaul," Richard corrected. "Why didn't you call me for clarification?" "Because you were in the board meeting. You asked me not to interrupt you during board meetings unless it was an emergency." He stared at her. This situation required clarification. Clarification is not an emergency interruption. "I didn't want to bother you." "Your job is to bother me when you need clarification," Richard said flatly. "Your job is to ask questions. Your job is not to make assumptions and execute them independently." Victoria felt something crumple in her chest, that particular feeling that came when you'd failed at something you were supposed to be good at. She'd been making him look good. She'd been making everything work. And somehow, by trying to manage the situation independently, she'd done exactly the wrong thing. "I'll call you for clarification on all ambiguous communications in the future," she said, her voice very controlled. "Victoria, is there anything else you need me to review before I return to my desk?" She left before he could answer. The next 3 days were professionally cordial and emotionally distant. Richard still stopped by her desk with questions, but the easy rhythm they'd developed was gone. His questions were perfunctory. His tone was strictly professional. He didn't ask about her weekend or mention anything personal. It was, Victoria realized with some surprise, worse than if he'd yelled. By Friday, she was actively trying to transfer to another department. She'd contacted HR, mentioned her interest in moving to a different executive assistant position, and started reviewing openings in other companies. She couldn't work in an environment where she'd disappointed him. It was too much. The anxiety would eat her alive. That Friday evening, when most of the office had cleared out, Richard stopped by her desk. "I'm sorry," he said without preamble. "My response to the roof situation was disproportionate." Victoria continued organizing her files. "You were right. I should have called for clarification." "You should have, yes," Richard agreed. "But I also should have been clearer in my initial communication. I sent you a vague email and then acted like your interpretation was unreasonable. That wasn't fair." Victoria looked up. "Are you always this rational about admitting mistakes?" "No," Richard said. "Usually I'm terrible at it. I blame my upbringing, extensive therapy, and the fact that you're apparently someone whose opinion I care about." The last part of that sentence hung in the air like something dangerous. "My opinion?" Victoria repeated carefully. "Yes," Richard said. He was doing that thing with his jaw again. "I spent the last 3 days in a foul mood because I thought I'd upset you, and I didn't like that. I also realized I've been somewhat dictatorial about how you should manage communications with me, which is ironic, given that I've explicitly told you I value alternative perspectives. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to set up a better system for communication," Richard said. "One where you feel comfortable asking for clarification without worrying about interrupting me. One where I'm more explicit about what I need. One where we're both operating with the same information." Victoria set down her pen. "Why do you care about this so much?" Because 3 days without our usual dynamic was apparently enough to make me re-evaluate my entire management style," Richard said, "which suggests that you've become important to the way I function in this company, and possibly in ways that extend beyond the company." "Today," There was a very specific moment, a very specific second, where Victoria understood that something was shifting in a way that couldn't be shifted back. "You can't mean that," she said carefully. "I can, and I do. I'm aware that there's a professional boundary here, and I'm trying to respect it. But I wanted you to know that the last 3 days have been genuinely difficult, and it's because I value your presence in my life beyond your executive assistant capabilities." Victoria's heart was doing something ridiculous, something that involved arrhythmia and poor decision-making. "Richard, you don't have to say anything," he said. "I just wanted you to understand that I'm not someone who usually connects with people this quickly. I'm not someone who usually cares about other people's opinions of me, but you managed to be the exception to both of those things, and I wanted to be honest about that." He turned and walked back toward his office, leaving Victoria sitting at her desk with her organizational systems completely upended and her anxiety at maximum capacity. She should probably update her list of problematic observations, except this time the observation would be more complicated. He's honest about his feelings, which is somehow more terrifying than if he'd pretended they didn't exist. Monday arrived with the inevitability of a tax bill. Victoria had spent the weekend doing exactly what she did every weekend, organizing her life into layers of chaos prevention. She'd reorganized her apartment, planned her meals, created a new spreadsheet to track her sleep habits. Anything to avoid thinking about Richard Ashford, saying she'd become important to him in ways that extended beyond the company. But here she was, Monday morning, sitting at her desk, watching him pass by with 2 cups of coffee. "For you," he said, placing one beside her keyboard. "Oat milk latte. No extra sugar. I learned your orders." Victoria looked at the coffee like it was an explosive device. "Richard, professionally speaking," he continued, already walking back, "we need to review the Q2 strategy in my office in 30 minutes. Personally speaking, I couldn't stop thinking about you over the weekend, which is disturbing given my history of emotional control." And he simply disappeared into his office. Victoria stared at the coffee, then at the time, then at the fact that he'd memorized her exact order, including the oat milk specification, which she'd never explicitly mentioned. "You're in trouble," Marcus whispered, materializing at her desk like a professional ghost. "That coffee is a problem in beverage form." "It's just coffee," Victoria protested. "It's not just coffee. It's a CEO saying he can't stop thinking about you without corporate protective language. That's a problem." 30 minutes later, Victoria was in his office, and Richard was closing the door. "We can't do this," she said immediately. "Do what?" "Anything that isn't work. There's a hierarchy here. You're my boss. This is ethically complicated, professionally disastrous, and you've already prepared a list of reasons before I even had a chance to speak?" Richard asked, and there was humor in his voice. "That's very you." "Richard, I'm serious." "I know you are," he said, sitting on the sofa instead of behind his desk, a deliberate move that eliminated the power distance between them. "That's why I'm being serious too. I'm not suggesting we ignore professionalism. I'm suggesting we acknowledge that there's something here worth exploring. What exists here is a dynamic based on professional proximity and mutual admiration," Victoria argued. "It's not romance. It's good transference of trust." "You really believe that?" Victoria didn't answer. The honest answer was no. The honest answer was that she thought about him when she should be sleeping, that she caught herself organizing documents at his desk just to be near his office, that the coffee he'd brought this morning was the most romantically thoughtful thing anyone had ever done for her. "I'll be honest," Richard continued. "I'm attracted to you. Intellectually, emotionally, and yes, physically too. You're intelligent, challenging, and the only person in this company who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. That's rare. You're rare. I can't work for someone who says things like that." "Then stop working for me," Richard said simply. Victoria blinked. "What?" If the power dynamic is the problem, we eliminate the power dynamic, he said. You transfer to a lateral position. Keep working with me, but technically I'm no longer your direct supervisor. HR can handle the details. That's corporate manipulation to circumvent ethical issues. Yes, Richard agreed. It's also honest. I'm willing to make structural adjustments because you matter to me, and I'd rather have you in my life in some capacity than lose you completely due to HR policies. The transfer was processed in 48 hours. Officially, Victoria was now Executive Operations Strategist, a position that had apparently been created entirely to justify why she was still working with Richard, but technically wasn't under his direct supervision. It was absurd. It was transparent. It was exactly the kind of thing an extremely rich CEO accustomed to getting what he wanted would do. And it worked. For the first week, everything was professional. Formal meetings, email communication, the careful maintenance of boundaries. But Friday night, when Victoria was collecting materials and Richard was in his office, the boundary simply evaporated. "Come with me," he said without preamble. "Where?" "Out of the building. There's a bar in the lobby where normal people go to drink and enjoy Miami. You should experience it." Victoria looked at her watch. "It's 10 p.m. "Exactly. Perfect time to do something completely unscheduled," Richard said. "When was the last time you did something completely unplanned?" The honest answer was, never. Her entire life was an exercise in chaos prevention through planning. 15 minutes later, she was in a bar called Mojito Moon, with music too loud and people too many, and Richard was ordering drinks while his hand rested casually on the back of her chair. He wasn't touching her exactly, but she felt the proximity of his touch like a promise. "You're nervous," he observed. "I'm in public with you, like this," Victoria said. "People could notice." "Let them notice," Richard said. "I'm not hiding you. There's nothing about this I want to hide." The drink arrived, something called Tropical Escape, that had a plastic umbrella. Victoria drank it nervously while Richard talked to her about things completely unrelated to work. His favorite places in Miami, a book he'd read recently, how he learned to sail because his father insisted that rich men need to know how not to die in the ocean. And then, somewhere between the second drink and a conversation about why Victoria color-coded her wardrobe when she technically knew it was obsessive, Richard simply leaned close enough that only she could hear him. "I'm very close to kissing you," he said. "Do you want me to pull my lips back or do you want me to keep going?" Victoria felt her heart do something dangerous. "We can't." "Why not?" "Because once it starts, I won't want it to stop. And stopping will be difficult and complicated and—" Richard leaned closer. His lips were so close she could feel the warmth of his breath. "Exactly," he whispered. And then his phone rang. Richard cursed low, the first time Victoria heard him do it, and looked at the screen. His expression changed. Something happened to his face. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. "It's my mother," he said. "Something happened. I need to go home." He left without explanation. Victoria spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended anxiety, checking her phone obsessively for messages that didn't come. Richard's office sat empty. His calendar was cleared. The only communication was an automated response. "I'm attending to a family matter. I will respond to emails upon my return." By Wednesday morning, she'd convinced herself of several things. 1. The almost kiss had scared him, and he was retreating into professional distance. 2. His family situation was serious enough that romance had become irrelevant. 3. She'd been foolish to let her guard down, and now she was paying the price through the particular torture of silence. She was organizing files, her default anxiety response, when he appeared at her desk. Richard looked like he'd been dismantled and reassembled incorrectly. His usual, impeccable appearance had fractured. His hair wasn't perfectly styled, his tie was loosened. There was something in his eyes that suggested he'd spent 3 days in a state of controlled panic. "My mother had a stroke," he said without preamble. Minor, but she's recovering in the hospital. She's going to be fine, but she's terrified, and my father is overwhelmed, and I've spent the last 72 hours ensuring she has the best neurological care available and helping my family understand that this isn't the end of her life, just a complication." Victoria stood up immediately. "Richard, I'm so sorry. Is there anything—" "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand why I disappeared," he continued. "And because I want you to know that when I was sitting in that hospital room at 3 in the morning, when I was watching my mother struggle to find words she usually finds effortlessly, when I was confronting the reality that people we love can become fragile without warning, I kept thinking about you, Richard. Not in a distracting way," he said, "in a clarifying way. I realized that I've spent my entire life building control systems, building companies, building walls. And the only thing that actually matters when you're facing real loss is the people you've let pass those walls. You're one of those people. I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to maintain professional distance or respect arbitrary boundaries. I want you in my life, completely, messily, without the corporate structure softening the reality of it." Victoria felt her carefully organized worldview shift on its axis. "Your mother almost died," she said carefully. "No," Richard corrected, "but she easily could have. That changes perspective. You're processing trauma and projecting emotional intensity onto our situation." "I'm doing exactly that," Richard acknowledged, "but that doesn't make it less true. I want you, Victoria, not as an employee, not as a professional colleague, as someone I choose to share my life with." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone who'd spent the weekend confronting mortality and had emerged with absolute certainty about what mattered. "I need to think," she said finally. "Okay," Richard said. He didn't seem disappointed, which was somehow worse. "But while you're thinking, I want you to know that I'm not going back to pretending this doesn't exist, and I'm not waiting indefinitely." Richard's mother had suffered a minor stroke. The word minor was relative. It meant she could still speak, still move most of her body, but it meant Richard spent the entire weekend in a private hospital in Coral Gables, looking like someone had fundamentally reorganized his internal architecture. Victoria found out about it Monday morning when she arrived at the office to find his desk empty and an email in her inbox sent at 3 a.m. "Handle the Westbrook presentation. I'm dealing with a family situation. I will be back Wednesday." No explanation, no context, just a CEO who'd left her in a state of romantic limbo and then vanished into crisis mode. She'd spent the weekend oscillating between anger and worry. By Monday, worry had won decisively. By Tuesday evening, she couldn't take it anymore. She drove to Coral Gables Hospital without planning the route, which was entirely unlike her. She arrived at the information desk and asked for Margaret Ashford, Richard's mother, and was redirected to the 4th floor without interrogation. Apparently having Ashford as your last name came with certain privileges even in patient privacy situations. She found his room number and stood outside the door for approximately 47 seconds, which was long enough for her anxiety to produce several compelling arguments about why she should leave immediately. She ignored them and knocked. Richard opened the door. He looked worse in person than he'd looked Friday night. More worn, more fragile, like someone had spent the weekend systematically removing his usual armor. He was wearing a grey sweater and jeans, which was so far removed from his normal aesthetic that Victoria almost didn't recognize him. "Victoria," he said, and his voice was rough, "what are you doing here?" "You didn't call," she said. "You didn't text. You didn't send an email with updates. You just disappeared. So I came to make sure you hadn't actually died or decided to move to another country to avoid professional complications." His expression shifted, something between gratitude and something raw, more vulnerable. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. The hospital room was exactly what you'd expect from a private facility catering to wealthy patients. Expensive, but still fundamentally a place where people came to experience medical crises. Margaret Ashford was sitting up in bed, looking smaller than hospital beds usually allowed people to look, with her right side slightly slack in a way that indicated the stroke had affected her motor control. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and they tracked Victoria with the kind of assessment that suggested she'd inherited her analytical nature from her mother. "Richard," Margaret said, her words slightly slurred but perfectly understandable, "are you going to introduce me to this woman, or are you going to keep her hovering in the doorway like she's afraid of catching something?" Victoria felt her face flush. "Mom, this is Victoria Chen. She's my—" Richard paused, and Victoria realized he was actually searching for the correct description. "She's important to me." Margaret's smile was slow and knowing. "I see. And does this important woman have a name she'd like to share, or is she maintaining mysterious silence?" "Victoria," Victoria said, stepping forward and extending her hand before remembering that handshakes were complicated for her. She withdrew it awkwardly. "I'm Victoria. I work with Richard at the company." "You work with him," Margaret repeated, her eyes moving between them with the kind of perceptiveness that suggested she'd just completed an entire psychological profile in approximately 6 seconds. "That's one way to describe it." "Mom," Richard said, and there was a note of warning in his voice. "Don't mom me," Margaret replied. "I just had a stroke." "I've earned the right to be direct about things. This woman came to the hospital without being invited, which suggests either genuine concern or impressive manipulation skills. Given her nervous energy and the fact that you look like you haven't slept since Friday, I'm going to assume genuine concern." Victoria didn't know whether to sit down or flee the state. "How are you feeling?" she asked, defaulting to professional safety. "Like someone hijacked my nervous system and left me with a faulty vehicle," Margaret said. "But the doctors assure me that recovery is quite possible with proper physical therapy and medication management. They're very optimistic, less optimistic about my son's emotional state, though they used more clinical language." Richard moved to adjust his mother's pillow, a gesture so tender that Victoria felt something in her chest reorganize itself. "I'm fine," he said. "You're catastrophizing," Margaret corrected. "You always catastrophize when you lose control of situations. Your father is doing the same thing, except he's catastrophizing by attempting to reorganize my entire medical care plan, which, frankly, we don't need. What we need is for people to stop treating me like I'm fragile and start helping me adjust to this new reality." She paused, looking directly at Victoria. "So, Victoria, are you the reason my son has been checking his phone every 45 seconds since he arrived at this hospital?" "I don't," Victoria started. "Yes," Richard said flatly. "She is." 20 minutes later, Victoria was sitting in the hospital waiting room while Richard was with his mother and his father, a man who apparently looked exactly like Richard would look in 30 years, if 30 years involved acquiring more worry lines and significantly less emotional availability. She was reviewing her phone obsessively, a habit she recognized as anxious behavior, when Richard emerged looking like someone who'd just negotiated a peace treaty and lost. "Thank you for coming," he said, sitting down beside her. "How is she?" "Frustrated," Richard said, which is actually a good sign. Stroke victims who are angry about their situation tend to recover better than those who accept defeat. "My mother is nothing if not competitive." They sat in silence for a moment. Victoria could hear the ambient sounds of the hospital, machines beeping, distant conversations, the particular quality of fluorescent-lit fluorescent pain that all medical facilities seem to share. "I was terrified," Richard said quietly. "I came home Friday evening and my father called me and he said, 'Your mother is in the hospital,' and for approximately 30 seconds I couldn't process that as information. It felt like the universe was explaining something in a language I didn't understand. I got to the hospital and she was conscious but confused, and the doctors were doing tests, and I just kept thinking." He stopped. "You kept thinking what?" Victoria prompted. That I've spent my entire life believing that if I worked hard enough, planned well enough, controlled enough variables, I could prevent bad things from happening, Richard said. But you can't. You can't prevent anything. You can only decide what matters when everything falls apart. And what matters? Victoria asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. You, Richard said simply. You matter. More than the company. More than my need for control. More than maintaining professional distance or respecting arbitrary boundaries. You're the first person I thought of when I realized my mother might not be okay. That's not something I'm going to ignore. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a settling of pieces that had been displaced since Friday night. Your mother hates me, she said. Richard smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his exhausted face. My mother is already planning your wedding. She told me, and I quote, she came to the hospital without being asked, and she has good organizational energy. Don't fuck this up. She didn't say that. Close enough, Richard said. My mother is many things, but subtle is not one of them. Victoria went home to her apartment that night and did something she'd never done before. She made a list of reasons to say yes to Richard Ashford. The list was long. It included things like, he listens, and he challenges me, and he makes me want to be braver than I usually am. It included smaller things too. He remembers my coffee order, and he laughs at my jokes, and he looked at his mother with such tenderness that I forgot to be anxious for approximately 30 seconds. But underneath all of that, the real reason was simpler. He saw her, not the organized version, not the professional version, but the actual Victoria underneath all the systems and structures. And he chose her anyway. She called him at 11 p.m. Yes, she said when he answered, not bothering with greeting. Yes to what, he asked, though she could hear the smile in his voice. To you, to this, to whatever this is. But, she continued, because she was Victoria and she required parameters, we need to be honest about the complications. We work together. Your mother had a stroke. We're going to have difficult moments where my anxiety conflicts with your need for control. I know, Richard said, and we need to go slowly. I don't want to rush into something that falls apart because we move too fast. Okay, he said. And if this doesn't work, we need to have a conversation about whether we can continue working together without it being weird. Agreed, Richard said, though I'm planning for us to work out in a way that makes weird completely irrelevant. That's very optimistic. I'm allowed to be optimistic, Richard said. I just spent the weekend contemplating mortality, and I emerged with absolute certainty about what I want. Optimism is justified. Victoria smiled despite herself. Your mother would approve of that logic. My mother already approves of you, Richard said. She told my father that you're exactly the kind of woman who could keep me from becoming a completely insufferable control freak. And that's basically a marriage proposal in my family. We've known each other for 6 weeks. And you rejected my handshake on day 1, Richard pointed out. You've been establishing dominance since we met. My mother recognizes this. Victoria laughed, actually laughed, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for days. I should go to sleep, she said. Agreed, Richard said. But Victoria, yes, thank you for coming to the hospital. Thank you for not giving up on me when I disappeared. Thank you for being someone worth disrupting my entire life for. 2 weeks of dating Richard Ashford was like operating a high-performance vehicle designed by someone who'd never experienced a traffic jam. Everything was efficient, planned, perfect, which was exactly the problem. They had dinner reservations at restaurants he'd researched. He brought her thoughtful gifts, a book she'd mentioned wanting, flowers that matched the aesthetic of her apartment. He texted her good morning messages at precisely 7 a.m., He kissed her in ways that suggested he'd studied the biomechanics of optimal lip contact. It was, Victoria realized with creeping dread, completely sterile. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Richard suggested they spend Saturday visiting his mother's physical therapy session. followed by lunch at a restaurant he'd already selected, followed by a movie he'd curated based on her stated preferences. "What if I want to do something spontaneous?" Victoria heard herself say. Richard looked up from his phone. "You don't do spontaneous. You color-code your wardrobe." "I could change." "You could," he agreed carefully. "But why would you? You're happy with structure." "I'm happy with my structure," Victoria said. "This feels like your structure transplanted onto my life. We're not building something together, we're fitting me into your system." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "I don't know how to do spontaneous," Richard said finally. "I've never been spontaneous a day in my life." "I know," Victoria said, "and I've never been able to let go of control. So maybe we should actually try instead of just playing at this." They decided, after an hour of negotiation that was somehow both boring and emotionally intense, to spend Saturday doing absolutely nothing planned. Richard arrived at Victoria's apartment at 10 a.m. on Saturday, looking visibly uncomfortable, like someone had asked him to speak a language he'd never learned. "So," he said, "what are we doing?" "I have no idea," Victoria admitted. "That's the point." They ended up walking through Wynwood, the Miami Arts District, without a destination. Richard kept trying to optimize the route. Victoria kept dragging him into random galleries. He suggested lunch at noon. She wanted to wait until they were actually hungry. By 1 p.m., they were sitting on a curb eating tacos from a food truck that Richard would normally have researched for health code violations, and he was telling her about his childhood, real stories, not the sanitized version he usually provided. "My father wanted me to be a surgeon," he said. "He was a cardiac surgeon, very successful, very controlled. I think I became obsessed with control because that was the metric of success in my family, the ability to eliminate variables." "What changed?" Victoria asked. "You," Richard said. "You're a variable I can't eliminate, and I'm discovering that I don't want to." By evening, they discovered something unexpected. They actually enjoyed each other when there was no agenda. They returned to Victoria's apartment and made dinner together, something neither of them had planned, using whatever ingredients she had available. Richard kept trying to follow ratios. Victoria kept adding things randomly. The result was chaotic and surprisingly delicious. "This would never pass food safety standards," Richard observed, eating a second plate. "Probably not," Victoria agreed, "but it tastes better than your optimized meals." "Because there's no predictability," he said, "which shouldn't work, but somehow does." Later, sitting on her couch with wine neither of them had chosen beforehand, Richard said, "I need you to understand something. I'm going to revert to control sometimes. It's my default response to anxiety, but I'm going to try to let you in on that, instead of just implementing solutions without you. And I'm going to try to be less rigid about how things should happen," Victoria said. "But I'm also going to need some structure. I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and become a spontaneous person." "I don't want you to," Richard said. "I want you to be you. I just want to be able to exist in your world without feeling like I'm disrupting it." "You disrupt it," Victoria said, "but I think I like that." The following week they found a rhythm that actually worked. Some days were planned, Richard's need for structure integrated with Victoria's comfort in it. Other days were deliberately open-ended. They established actual communication about expectations instead of assuming they understood each other. It was slower than the early intensity. It was also real. By Friday, when Richard's mother was discharged from physical therapy and officially cleared to return home, Victoria was introduced to her formally, not as important, but as my girlfriend. Margaret smiled in a way that suggested she'd known this outcome was inevitable from the moment Victoria walked into that hospital room. "Well," she said, shaking Victoria's hand firmly, "about time my son learned that love requires adaptation instead of just discipline." Victoria realized, watching Richard interact with his mother, watching his careful attention, his genuine concern, his ability to be both controlled and warm, that she wasn't just falling in love with him. She was choosing him, deliberately. with her eyes open to both his complications and her own, and he was choosing her too. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m., which was early enough to suggest urgency, and late enough to suggest someone had been awake all night, wrestling with a decision. Victoria read it on her phone while still in bed, and her stomach executed a perfect nosedive. Emergency board meeting, 9 a.m., conference room A, all senior leadership mandatory, board chair Thornton. She called Richard immediately. "I know," he said. His voice was flat, in a way that suggested he'd been expecting this. "I got the call at midnight. Something happened with the Westbrook account." Westbrook Industries was their largest client. They represented approximately 30% of annual revenue. They also represented the project that Victoria and Richard had worked on together during their first weeks, the one where she'd moved the presentation to the roof. "What happened?" Victoria asked. "I don't know yet," Richard said. "But whatever it is, it's bad enough that Thornton is calling an emergency board meeting without briefing me first. That doesn't happen unless they're planning something structural." They arrived at the office separately, a professional decision they'd made weeks ago to avoid speculation. Victoria was at her desk by 8:15 a.m., reviewing every document related to Westbrook that she could access. Emails, contracts, project timelines, communications logs. Everything looked normal. Richard emerged from his office at 8:45 a.m., looking like someone who'd prepared for war, but wasn't entirely confident about which side he was on. He was wearing his armor, the three-piece suit, the tie that cost more than some people's car payments. The expression that suggested emotion was a luxury he couldn't currently afford. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, stopping at her desk, "I want you to know that this isn't your fault. This isn't us. This is business, and sometimes business is brutal." "What are you talking about?" Victoria asked. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I have a feeling I'm about to find out." The board meeting lasted 42 minutes. Victoria knew this because she spent those 42 minutes staring at her computer screen, while her hands shook slightly and her anxiety produced increasingly catastrophic scenarios. When Richard emerged, he looked like someone had systematically dismantled his confidence with surgical precision. "My office," he said quietly. "Now." She followed him, closing the door behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Westbrook is leaving," Richard said finally. "They're moving their account to Synchronous Technologies. They're also suing us for breach of contract regarding the project scope that was altered without their explicit written consent." Victoria felt the floor tilt slightly, but we had approval. "They signed. They're claiming they approved the original scope, not the modified version," Richard said. "And technically they're right. We expanded the project without getting their sign-off on the expanded parameters. But that was standard procedure. Every client goes through scope creep. We managed it in the proposal documentation." "We documented it," Richard corrected. "We didn't get them to acknowledge it in a binding agreement, which means legally they have a case." Victoria's mind was already organizing the timeline, the communications, the decision points. "This happened because of the roof presentation," she said slowly. "When I moved the meeting without confirming with you, we had to reorganize the project logistics, which created the scope expansion. This happened because I didn't establish clear communication protocols with you," Richard said, and his voice was sharp in a way that suggested he was being sharp with himself, not her. "I told you to make decisions independently. You made them. The consequences are on both of us." "No," Victoria said, "this is my responsibility. I made the decision to move the presentation without confirmation. I created the domino effect. And I approved the scope expansion without requiring written client consent," Richard said. "We both made decisions that led to this, which is why the board is suggesting that maybe our working relationship is compromising our professional judgment." Victoria understood then what he was saying, and why he'd looked the way he did, emerging from that meeting. "They're blaming me," she said. "They're blaming us," Richard corrected. But they're specifically questioning whether I'm able to maintain objectivity with you involved in operational decisions. They're suggesting that perhaps I promoted you too quickly, that perhaps I'm letting personal feelings cloud professional judgment. What did you tell them? I told them they could go to hell, Richard said flatly. And then I told them I'd review the Westbrook situation and propose a solution by end of business today. Richard, this is the thing about relationships in corporate environments, he said, and there was something bitter in his voice. They're always going to question whether your judgment is compromised, and they're always going to be partially right. Because love does compromise judgment, but they use that as an excuse to dismiss you, to suggest that you don't belong in a position of authority. They spent the next 4 hours reviewing every communication with Westbrook, every decision point, every moment where they'd failed to maintain explicit written confirmation. Victoria identified the problem at 2:40 p.m. The original proposal included language about scope optimization based on technical requirements, she said, pointing to a paragraph she'd highlighted, which they did sign off on. It's vague, but it's there. If we can demonstrate that the scope expansion fell within the parameters of technical optimization, we have a defense. That's a weak argument, Richard said. But it's an argument, Victoria replied. And if we can show that every major decision was communicated to their project manager, even if it wasn't formalized in writing, we can establish that they had opportunity to object. Richard looked at her, really looked at her, and Victoria saw something shift in his expression. You're trying to fix this, he said. Of course I'm trying to fix this. Even though fixing it might require me to throw you under the bus, he said. The board would be happier if I suggested that you made operational decisions without proper authorization. That would protect my position. Victoria met his eyes. Are you going to do that? No, Richard said, because that would be a lie. And more importantly, because you matter more to me than protecting my position. He paused. But I need you to understand what that means. If I defend you in this, if I take responsibility for the scope expansion with you, we're both potentially vulnerable. The board is going to push back. They might suggest I'm not fit for this position. They might suggest you're not fit for yours. I understand, Victoria said. Do you? Richard asked. Because this isn't theoretical anymore. This is actual professional jeopardy for both of us. Victoria thought about everything she'd built, her reputation, her career trajectory, her carefully organized professional life. She thought about what it would cost to defend Richard, to defend herself, to insist on honesty in a situation where dishonesty would be much easier. Yes, she said, I understand. And I still want you to defend us. Because if you don't, then what we built means nothing. It was just convenient until it became complicated. The presentation to the board happened at 4 p.m. Richard walked in with Victoria, which in itself was a statement. They presented the evidence together, not as CEO and subordinate, but as a unified team that had made a decision and was standing by it. The scope expansion was within the parameters of the original agreement, Richard said calmly. And while the documentation could have been more explicit, the client was informed of every major decision. They had opportunity to object. They didn't. What you're asking this board to accept, said Patricia Chen, the board's lead attorney, is that a vague contract clause absolves us of responsibility for scope creep. That's not a strong legal position. It's not a strong legal position, Victoria said, speaking for the first time. But it's the actual factual record. Westbrook was informed. They chose not to object. We have email documentation of every major decision. If they want to argue that they misunderstood the agreement, that's a negotiation problem, not a legal problem. You're suggesting we negotiate? Thornton asked. I'm suggesting we offer a settlement that stops the lawsuit, Victoria said. We cover 15% of the expanded scope costs. They acknowledge that they were informed of the expansion and chose to proceed. Everyone walks away without litigation. The board members exchanged glances. That's a significant cost, Thornton said. Less than litigation, Victoria replied, and significantly less than the reputational damage of a lawsuit that's ultimately defensible but also ultimately expensive to defend. There was silence. Then Patricia Chen smiled slightly. The young woman has a point, she said, and she also has a grasp of risk management that frankly exceeds what we usually see at this level. I suggest we follow her recommendation. The penthouse apartment overlooked Biscayne Bay, and it was nothing like anything Victoria would have chosen for herself. It was also, she was discovering, exactly what she needed. Richard had suggested moving in together with the kind of casual certainty that suggested he'd already researched optimal Miami neighborhoods, calculated commute times, and identified properties within their combined budget. Victoria had countered by insisting they choose together, which meant 3 weekends of touring apartments, while she took notes on layout efficiency and he took notes on market appreciation potential. They'd settled on this place because it had a view that made you remember the world was bigger than spreadsheets and conference calls, and because the kitchen was large enough for both of them to occupy simultaneously without collision. She was unpacking boxes, organized by room, naturally, when Richard arrived home from the office, carrying flowers and the kind of expression that suggested he'd been planning something. "We need to talk," he said. Victoria's anxiety immediately produced several scenarios, none of them good. In her experience, "we need to talk" was either a prelude to a breakup or a proposal, and she wasn't prepared for either. "Okay," she said carefully. Richard set the flowers on the counter and took her hands. "I've been thinking about what happened with Westbrook, about how you solved that problem, about how you've fundamentally changed the way I approach business and life and basically everything." "Richard, let me finish," he said. "6 months ago, I was someone who believed that control and efficiency were the same thing as success. You've shown me that sometimes the best solutions come from collaboration, from vulnerability, from being willing to be wrong." "You're scaring me," Victoria said. "You never make speeches. You're allergic to emotion." "I'm about to make the most emotional decision of my life," he said, "and I wanted to do it properly, which for me means actually articulating it instead of just implementing it." He pulled a small box from his pocket. Victoria's breath stopped. "I don't have a flowery speech prepared," Richard continued, "because you'd see through it immediately. What I have is the truth. I love you. Not the organized version of you, not the professional version, the actual you, anxious and brilliant and obsessive and brave. And I want to build a life with you that has structure when we need it and spontaneity when we choose it. I want to wake up next to someone who challenges me. I want to become the kind of person who's worth choosing by someone like you." He opened the box. The ring was simple. A white gold band with a single diamond, no excess, no unnecessary complexity. It was, Victoria realized, exactly the kind of ring she would have chosen if she'd allowed herself to imagine being proposed to. "Victoria Chen," Richard said, and his voice was steady in the way that suggested he'd practiced this but was delivering it genuinely. "Will you marry me?" The wedding planning was where Victoria discovered something crucial about herself. She could organize a wedding, but only if she did it with Richard, which meant their planning process became a metaphor for their entire relationship. Victoria wanted color coordination, a detailed timeline, assigned seating based on compatible personality types. Richard wanted efficiency, minimal fuss, a celebration rather than a production. They compromised by creating a wedding that was organized but also genuinely joyful, structured enough that Victoria wouldn't have a panic attack, spontaneous enough that Richard wouldn't feel like he was attending a military operation. Margaret Ashford recovered significantly from her stroke, though still dealing with minor mobility issues, became the unexpected emotional director of the entire event. "You're both overthinking this," she said during a planning meeting 6 weeks before the wedding. "You're trying to create the perfect wedding instead of creating a wedding that represents who you actually are." which is obsessive, slightly chaotic, and deeply committed to each other. Why isn't the wedding reflecting that? So they changed everything. Instead of assigned seating, they created place cards with questions designed to start conversations between people who didn't know each other. Instead of a rigid timeline, they built in unplanned time for actual connection. Instead of a formal reception line, they actually spent time at each table talking to people who had come to celebrate them. Victoria's family brought dim sum to the reception, which technically violated catering contracts, but created the kind of chaotic abundance that made the event feel like home. Richard's family brought stories and genuine warmth. His father, it turned out, had a surprisingly good sense of humor when he wasn't busy being intimidated by his own son. 2 days before the wedding, Victoria and Richard were alone in their apartment, doing final preparations when Richard said, "I want you to know that I'm terrified." "Of what?" Victoria asked, looking up from the spreadsheet where she was tracking final logistics. "Of failing you," he said. "Of becoming the kind of husband who reverts entirely to control. Of losing the parts of me that you've helped develop." "You won't," Victoria said, "because I'll call you out, and because you've genuinely changed. You're not the same person you were 6 months ago." "Neither are you," Richard said. "You've become braver. You've learned to let go when it matters." "I still color-code my wardrobe," Victoria said. "I know," Richard smiled. "And I love that about you. I love all the obsessive, organized parts. I just also love the parts that are learning to be spontaneous." The wedding happened on a Saturday in November because Victoria had determined that November had optimal weather patterns and acceptable humidity levels. Richard wore a suit that fit him perfectly, which was not surprising. Victoria wore a dress that was elegant but also comfortable, which required extensive shopping research but ultimately felt authentic. They exchanged vows they'd written together, a collaboration that involved multiple drafts, honest feedback, and genuine emotion. "I promise to organize the chaos," Victoria said, "and to let you help me be brave enough to occasionally embrace it. I promise to listen when you explain things, even when you're being unnecessarily detailed. I promise to remember that you're human, not a CEO, and that you deserve to be seen as both. I promise to respect your need for structure," Richard said, "and to build systems that work for us instead of trying to force you into mine. I promise to be honest about my fears instead of covering them with control, and I promise to spend my entire life being grateful that you rejected my handshake." The ceremony made people laugh and cry in approximately equal measure. At the reception, Margaret gave a speech that made Richard actually tear up. Something Victoria had learned was rare enough to feel like a gift. "I spent years watching my son become smaller," Margaret said. "Not physically. Physically, he took up plenty of space. But emotionally, he became more controlled, more distant, more afraid of the messiness that comes with actually connecting with people. And then Victoria arrived and refused to follow his rules, and I watched him become bigger again. Not less controlled. That's not who he is, but more alive, more willing to take risks, more willing to be human." She paused, looking directly at Victoria. "Thank you for giving my son permission to be imperfect," Margaret said. "Thank you for being someone worth adapting for. And thank you for being brave enough to love someone who had to learn how." 1 year later, Victoria was in an office that was technically hers, a newly created position as Strategic Operations Director, which was corporate speak for the person who thinks about how systems should work, and also happens to be the CEO's wife. She'd maintained her obsession with organization, but now it served a larger purpose. She'd helped restructure how Richard's company approached client relationships, implementing better communication protocols, more explicit scope documentation, more collaborative decision-making. The Westbrook lawsuit had been settled 6 months earlier, and the relationship had actually improved afterward. Apparently, honesty and accountability were better for business relationships than denial and blame. Richard still worked late. Victoria still color-coded her wardrobe. They still occasionally disagreed about whether spontaneity or structure should take priority in any given situation. But they'd learned to fight in ways that didn't hurt, and to make up in ways that felt genuine. On a Tuesday evening, when they were both working late because some habits die hard, Richard looked up from his computer and said, "I was thinking we should take a vacation, completely unplanned, just pick a country and go." Victoria's immediate anxiety response started to form, then stopped. "Okay," she said, "but I'm researching visa requirements and weather patterns before we leave." "Obviously," Richard said. "I wouldn't expect anything less." He stood up and kissed her, not in the practiced, optimized way he'd kissed her early in their relationship, but in the messy, real, imperfect way that suggested he was kissing her with his entire self, not just the parts he'd learned would work. Victoria kissed him back and thought about the girl who'd rejected a handshake because handshakes felt too unpredictable. That girl had been right to be cautious, but she'd also been right to take the risk. Sometimes the most important things in life were the ones you couldn't control or organize or plan for. Sometimes they were the things that made you braver just by existing in your life. Sometimes they were CEOs who learned to embrace spontaneity, and anxious women who learned that structure wasn't the same as safety. Sometimes they were people who met in an elevator, rejected a handshake, and spent the next year learning that the best kind of love was the kind that made you want to become a better version of yourself, not because you had to, but because you wanted to deserve someone who was brave enough to love you completely.